Morning, folks. In the last video that I posted, you saw me change the differential and transfer case oil for the Range Rover. And considering that less than a year ago I changed the manual gearbox, or transaxle if you will, oil in the Opel, the last one on the list to have its differential and transfer case oil changed is the Kia, which is what we will be doing today. Now, in the Range Rover video, I spent a good couple of minutes explaining why it makes sense to change this oil, so there's really no point for me repeating all that information. I will put a link in the description pointing you exactly to that part of the video if you are interested in a bit of boring theory. But we will skip that here and jump straight into the action. And at the time of filming, the car is 8.5 years old and it's done 167,862 kilometers. And based on the warning light on the dash, I may have a flat tire, but I'll check that later. And before we actually jump into the action, let's first take a look at what kind and what amount of oil we need. We're interested in rear differential oil and transfer case oil. It says we need 0.65 liters for the rear diff and about 0.6 for the transfer case. The type, high point gear oil, GL5 75W90. So pick your favorite brand of 75W90 GL5 gear oil and you'll need about 1.25 liters. I would recommend slightly more because no doubt you will be losing a bit in the process. I will be sticking to Ravenol VSG, the same oil that I used for the Range Rover, as it seems to be behaving very well there. And let's also take a look at what the manual says about the changing intervals. Here it says that the diff and transfer case oil should be changed every 120,000 kilometers under certain conditions. Now these conditions, if you read them here, typically refer to a more severe kind of driving. What we can deduce from here is that the manual says if you don't do severe driving, you should never change it. That's really not something I agree with. It should always be changed, as I explained in the Range Rover video. Now, in the case of our Kia, with its existing mileage, given that it spent about 60% of its time on the open road, so light constant driving, and only about 40% city driving, more intense obviously because we're talking about Bucharest, I'm not terribly worried that we missed this interval by about 47,000 kilometers, but I've been wanting to do this job for quite some time now. And with that said, let's head over to the car. And I'm gonna start by removing the metal underbody shield. In my case, it's held in place with 13mm hex bolts, a couple of them here at the front and 2 at the back. But for the standard plastic underbody shield, I'm not really sure what the bolt size is, but in any case, this part is fairly trivial to do. So I'll do that offline and then come back. Okay, shield is out. And before I start draining and filling, I want to spend a bit of time again explaining the way the four-wheel drive system on this Kia Sportage works, because I want to contrast it to the one from the Range Rover, which I explained in the diff oil change video. And I want to show you that even though technically it is a four-wheel drive system, its architecture is very different from the one I presented earlier. Looking a bit at the underside of the engine, the Sportage, just like the Ceed and other cars of its class, with the exception of some sportier ones like the BMW X3 and a couple of other ones, typically have transversely mounted engines. Okay, so the engine goes from one side of the car to the other, from right to left. It's not longitudinal, from the front to the back, as we had in the case of the Range Rover. You can see here the engine oil pan, and then a little bit to its left, this unit here, which we will be tackling soon to change its oil as well, is the automatic transaxle in our case. If you have a manual, this would be a manual transmission or transaxle because it also has the differential inside. Now, if your car is only front-wheel drive, from the transaxle, you will only see the left and the right drive shafts, as you can see here. This is the left one, and up there is the right one. If, however, your car is spec'd with four-wheel drive, you'll also get another unit which is behind the engine and to the right of the transmission, which is this, our transfer case. Now, even though the name is similar, it has a completely different architecture than the one from the Range Rover. The one in the Range Rover had an open diff which splits the torque 50-50. With this one, things get more interesting. And this architecture will actually apply to a very, very large variety of transversely mounted engine all-wheel drive cars, from Volkswagens, Skodas, Kias, Hyundais, you name it. Even the Range Rover Evoque and Discovery Sport share the same architecture. So, what happens inside this unit is this. There is a shaft that's hollow inside, which is bolted directly to the body of the differential that is inside our gearbox. Through the inside of that shaft goes the right drive shaft that exits over here and goes to the wheel. Now, this initial shaft that I mentioned always spins, obviously being bolted to the diff, at the same speed of the diff, and somewhere around here it has a bevel gear, okay, that's oriented in this direction. On that bevel gear, perpendicular to it, there is another bevel gear. I'm not sure if the ratio is 1:1 or if it's slightly overdriven, but from the second bevel gear, the rear drive shaft is put in motion. Okay, this one here. So what this means is, even if the four-wheel drive system is disabled, the prop shaft will always spin at a given ratio to the differential. And obviously this means this is a slight parasitic loss. The guys over at Audi, when they introduced the Quattro Ultra, actually added some mechanisms to completely disconnect the prop shaft once the rear wheel drive of the system is not needed, to save a bit of mileage, but that's not particularly relevant for us in our case. Now we've moved on to the back of the car. Again, here is our rear drive shaft connected to, I don't remember if this is called I think it's called a guibo. It's a rubber component that allows torque to be applied to the rear but filters out some vibrations. You may want to check this out as well. Over time, obviously, the rubber inside gets torn and this needs to be replaced, but ours is in a good shape. Okay, now the first unit you see here is the coupler. The coupler essentially is electronically controlled. There are some wires, I don't know if you can see them over here, I think, which connect to this small electric motor. And that effectively opens and closes a clutch pack, which is placed here. And obviously that clutch pack enables the transmission of torque from the prop shaft, that, as I explained, is always spinning, to the rear differential, which is the one over here. So that's how this four-wheel drive system works. In normal driving, typically the clutch pack is open. Not sure if it's completely open. I read at some time that it's like only 10% closed. So only a very, very small amount of torque actually gets applied to the rear axle. But when the system wants to apply four-wheel drive, it simply closes the clutch pack, and then all of the torque from the prop shaft goes into the rear diff. And that explains why in this setup, at least, you can never have more than 50% of the torque to the rear. Okay? Simply because you always, absolutely always have torque to the front, and you don't necessarily always have torque to the rear. And once these close, obviously, the torque has to split on both axes. Okay, enough with the theory. Finally, let's move on to draining and filling stuff. And I'm gonna start with the one that's a bit more trickier because of the lack of space, which is the front transfer case, which has this here as its fill plug. It takes a 10 mil Allen, And down here, this is your drain plug. Worth mentioning, before starting this operation, make sure to buy new washers for all the plugs. I did, and I'll show that a bit later. And as always, we're going to start with the fill plug first. And if you want to see why that is worth it, I invite you to look at the problems I had with the transfer case for the Range Rover, which had its fill plug over tightened and partially rounded off. So yeah, well worth doing that. Apologies if I can't offer you the best angles, but as I said, the space is really tight. But anyways, let's see if we can crack this open. Yep, took a bit of effort, but we did it. And here is the little bugger. Go figure, it had some thread locker on it, it seems. And be mindful of the washer. You see, in this case, the washer is attached to it. See? So I'm gonna have to remove that before installing a new one. And with this out, I'm just gonna put it here back in for safekeeping. And let's move on to the draining. And this plug here takes a 24mm hex, and I'm gonna use a breaker bar to crack it open. And with our measuring jar ready, let's drain. I love it when plugs come out with such ease. Really do. Here it comes. And we're just gonna let it drain for a while. And while the draining is going on, let's take a look at the drain plug. Here it is. Hopefully it focuses well. Here is, yeah, those are nuts falling on the roof of the garage. Here it is. Hopefully it focused well. Took the washer out. And let's see how much metal shavings there are, because this has a magnet on top. That's a lot of nuts. All right, so there, whoa, okay. There clearly were some metal shavings, which I guess kind of makes sense, right? Given the fact that this oil has never been changed. So really good thing that we're doing it right now. So I'm gonna clean this up and prep it for installation. Here is our old washer. Here is our new washer. Put the washer on the drain bolt. Optionally, if you want, go ahead and apply some oil compatible thread locker. I'm using Loctite 243, the blue one, which is stated to be compatible with oils. And let's put this back in. And you can easily screw this one in by hand because it's not tapered. That's it. You don't even need a ratchet. And the tightening torque is between 58.9 and 78.5 Newton meters. I'm gonna choose about 70. And that is it. And looking at the oil that we got almost 600 milliliters. Which means that the oil level was correct and very little to no oil was lost. It still stinks like whatever, which means that it still had additives inside, which is a good thing. And best of all, if you take a look inside, you'll see that there are no sparkles, meaning there are no metal flakes or shavings inside. All of those were caught by the magnet, and the oil is pretty clean, which is very, very good news. Okay, now let's move on to filling the transfer case. So here's 600 milliliters of fresh gear oil, and check out how lovely it looks in comparison to the old one that we removed. And we're gonna use a hand pump to put it all in. Now for this car, the fill plug also acts as a level plug, which means that you have to fill with oil until oil starts to come out, starts to drip, which by extension means that you have to have your car as horizontal as possible in order to get the correct level. With that said, here's the first 400 milliliters of fresh oil. Pushing them in slowly. Okay, all done. Here's the rest of it. And here is oil coming out. So we filled it. Here's the cleaned up fill plug with a new washer. This is different than the washer used for the drain plug. No Loctite on this one. We don't want it to be too difficult to remove it the next time. And after the excess oil has drained, go ahead and put the plug back. Sorry, I can't give you a better angle. I'm tightening it by hand. Okay, just like that. And the tightening torque for the fill plug is between 39.2 and 58.8 Newton meters. I've chosen about 54. Again, the lack of space here is annoying. And that is it for the front transfer case. I'm gonna go ahead and clean up the area with brake cleaner, but I'll do that offline. And regarding the quantity of oil used, I started with 2 bottles, one full one with 1 liter, and the other one with 250 milliliters from the Range Rover job, so 1.25 liters in total. And I'm left with 550 milliliters, so that's 700 milliliters used up. As I said, 650 went into the box, and with the remaining amount I still have a little bit in the pump, and the rest dripped away. So we know we filled the transfer case to the correct amount. Here we are underneath the rear diff. Here is our drain plug, again 24 millimeter hex, just like the drain plug from the transfer case. And the fill plug is different. It's over here, and it is again a 24 millimeter hex, so not a 10 millimeter Allen. And the way to get to this is either through a thin wrench or ratchet, or a crowfoot extension if you have one of this size, but most commonly it's done through this hole over here, which is by design aligned with that plug. And we will be using this one as well. Like so. Here's my ratchet, a 1/2 inch extension, and there's a connection to the fill bolt. So let's see if this works. If not, I'm just gonna bring the breaker bar. And I found a way to make room for the breaker bar by using a longer 24 mil drive. And let's hope this works and I don't smack myself in the face. Yeah, it worked. Awesome. Hope you can see it. Apparently there's gonna be some oil coming out through the fill hole, so this diff may have been slightly overfilled from the factory. The fact that we had no problem basically is a testament to the fact that it's okay to ever so slightly overfill your diff. Oh wow, that's I'm just gonna put this one back because it's gonna make a mess. And I'm gonna go get my container. And while the excess oil is dripping from the fill plug, let us open the drain plug as well using the same breaker bar, and that's it. No problem whatsoever. Hope it doesn't make too much of a mess. And while the diff drains, let's look at the drain plug. This one, as well as the fill plug, have different washers. See, these are made of copper, not like the front ones, which were aluminum, I think, or aluminium. Anyways, let's look at the amount of shavings on the magnet. Okay, there was a little bit more actually. Plus, I had by mistake removed a little bit before getting a chance to film, so there's more than this. But this is no reason to worry, because this is just a normal amount given the car's mileage. So, I'm gonna take this, clean it, and prep it for installation. Here's the drain bolt all cleaned up with a new washer and with some Loctite applied. And it goes in directly by hand. Alright. And the tightening torque is between 49 and 68.6 Newton meters. I've chosen about 65. And that's it. And again, let's take a look at the oil that we obtained. So we got about 750 milliliters, and that is a good 100 milliliters above the level from the manual. But again, we've had no issues with the car. One interesting thing is the color is slightly different than the one from the front. Not sure if you can see it on the video, but the one from the front was pretty black, whereas this one is more grayish, greenish somehow, which kind of suggests that there are different types of metals used inside the transfer case and inside the diff. And again, the good news is we don't see any kind of metal flakes or anything sparkling inside the oil, which means that it is pretty clean. And there's no indication of any kind of upcoming mechanical problem with the diff. And with that said, let's move on to adding new oil. And here's fresh oil added in. Man, it's definitely a bit of a struggle to get the tube in, but with patience it gets in eventually, and easy does it. Okay, that's the first part in, and here's the rest of it. Okay, it seems I need a little bit more. And I'm switching over to a small 100 ml syringe right now, because apparently the pump that I have has a small chamber at the bottom, which is about 60 milliliters large, and whatever fluid gets in there can't be pushed out. So I needed to improvise a bit. And hopefully this should be enough. And finally, here is all coming out, so we know that the diff is full. Here is the cleaned up fill plug with a new copper washer. Let's clean up a bit before inserting it, and then simply tighten it in by hand. It goes in fairly easily. and the tightening torque is between 39.2 and 58.8 Newton meters. I've chosen about 54. And that is it. So the rear diff is complete as well. I've gone on and cleaned up everything, not just for aesthetics, but also to be able to later check for leaks. And now all we have to do is take the car out for a drive. Obviously, I won't be installing the underbody shield because I do want to be able to check for leaks. But since that means the engine oil pan and stuff are exposed, it's best to just drive carefully and avoid any kind of off-road. And I'm gonna do that off camera and come back when I'm done. Okay, I'm back. I drove the car for a number of miles and let's see what we got. So the rear diff looks absolutely fine. No signs of leaks anywhere, which is excellent. So good job here. And pretty much the same applies here in the front as well. No leaks here at the top. Most importantly, no leaks at all here at the bottom. So this one is also done, which means we just need to put back the underbody shield and we're just gonna move on to the conclusions. I'm gonna start the conclusions part by talking about the amount of oil used. As you've seen, the manual says 0.65 liters and 0.6 liters for a combined total of 1.25 liters. However, the actual values that I got from the diff, and this was the factory fill, were a bit higher. So you'll need, let's say, closer to 1.5 liters, also accounting for the inevitable losses. In both cases, 2 bottles of oil should be sufficient. Another important thing worth mentioning is related to the size of the washers. Now, if you take a look at the aluminum washers for the transfer case, notice that the inner diameter on the right one is smaller than the inner diameter of the left one. And these are 2 parts with 2 different part numbers, which I got. The same applies to the copper washers from the rear diff. However, this is where things get interesting because neither myself nor the Kia dealer were able to identify the part number for the drain plug washer, which is this one. So I did go with the assumption that both of them are of this size. This is the washer for the fill plug. And once I realized that was not the case, I actually had to use a Dremel with a small grinding head to slowly and carefully chip away a bit on the inside of this, in order to extend the inner diameter so that it would fit the bolt. Now, as I verified, there are no leaks whatsoever, so even though I had to customize, let's say, the drain plug washer, I did not take more material than needed, and it still seals absolutely fine. But do keep this in mind. The third thing I want to mention has to do with the proper tightening of the plugs. When I did the transfer case oil change for the Range Rover, I actually had quite a bit of difficulty in removing the fill plug because it had been over tightened and partially stripped, rounded at the previous oil change in the service. Whereas with the plugs on the differentials, I had no issue whatsoever because in that case, I had removed and installed them myself a couple of years ago and had tightened them to spec. And all I want to say is it's really well worth investing in a couple of torque wrenches, which are not terribly expensive. I don't know, you can find decent ones at 20, 30 euros, for example. And it really pays off to tighten not just plugs, but all car bolts in general to the torque given by the manufacturer, so as not to have any surprises when you try to remove them in the future, as it happened to me. And the fourth topic, as always, cost, which is pretty straightforward. I needed 2 bottles of VSG oil at about 14 euros a piece, so that's 28 euros, plus about 1 euro per washer, and I needed 4 washers, so about 32 euros in total, rounded off I suppose to 35, maybe 40, depending on how the parts vary in price, which is still a very good deal, considering that when I asked a certain Kia dealer for an offer for the same operations, they asked for about 120 euros, I think, so nearly 3 times as much, if not more. So overall, this is a fairly straightforward operation, which is easy and well worth doing. And with that said, thank you very much for watching. If you've enjoyed this video, please consider subscribing. I would be very grateful as always. And I wish you all a lovely day, and I will see you next time. Take care and goodbye.